I want you to close your eyes for a second. Imagine you're standing in a wide-open field. It's pitch black. It's the late 1990s, maybe 1998. You're looking up at the stars, waiting for something specific. You aren't looking for a meteor, and you aren't looking for a plane. You're waiting for a man-made star. And then right on schedule, down to the exact second, a point of light erupts out of the darkness. It swells in intensity, getting brighter and brighter, until for a few fleeting seconds, it is blazing like a welding torch in the sky. It's brighter than Venus. It's actually bright enough to cast a shadow on the grass around you. And then just as quickly as it appeared, it fades back into the void.
That was a signature event for a whole generation of amateur astronomers and skywatchers. You were watching an iridium flare.
Exactly. It wasn't magic, and it wasn't a UFO. It was sunlight hitting a massive door-sized antenna on a communications satellite-polished, silver-coated Teflon at just the perfect angle to reflect the sun right into your eyes. It was a blazing beacon announcing that humanity had put a new constellation in the sky.
It is a beautiful, almost poetic image, but when you look back at the history of technology, it's also deeply ironic because those flares were coming from a company that, commercially speaking, was burning up just as spectacularly as those reflections in the night sky.
That is the paradox we are unpacking in this deep dive. We are talking about Iridium. And depending on which business school case study you read, Iridium is either the biggest punchline in the history of corporate America, a company that incinerated billions of dollars and nearly dragged the legendary Motorola down with it, or it is one of the most resilient, essential pieces of infrastructure the world has ever built.
And the fascinating thing is that it is somehow both. We are looking at a system that cost $5 billion to build, was sold for pennies on the dollar, literally less than the cost of a mid-budget Hollywood movie. And today, if you are crossing the Arctic Ocean or tracking a tsunami in the Pacific or fighting a war in a remote region, your life probably depends on it.
And that's what we're going to dig into. We have pulled a massive stack of reports, technical documents, orbital mechanics breakdowns, and historical analyses to figure out how this thing actually works. We aren't just skimming the surface here. We are going to look at the architecture of the sky. How do you make 66 satellites dance around the Earth without crashing? We will look at the spectacular failure of the 90s, the infamous brick phone, and how the U.S. military basically resurrected the whole thing from the dead.
And we have to talk about the collision. The moment two satellites ran into each other at 22,000 miles per hour, that is a pivotal moment in space history that changed how we track debris forever.
Absolutely. That is a scene straight out of a disaster movie, but it was real physics. So let's start with the basics. The mission here was deceptively simple. Create a phone that works literally everywhere, not just where there are cell towers, but at the North Pole, in the middle of the Pacific, in the Sahara.
Right. And to understand why that was such a radical idea in the late 80s and early 90s, you have to understand the geography of space. At that time, if you wanted satellite communication, you were almost exclusively talking about geostationary orbit, or GEO.
Okay, let's unpack GEO. This is the high ground, right? The traditional parking spot for satellites.
It is the parking spot. If you launch a satellite to exactly 35,785 kilometers above the equator, its orbital period matches the Earth's rotation exactly 24 hours. To an observer on the ground, the satellite appears to hang motionless in the sky.
Ah, so that's why my satellite TV dish doesn't need to move.
That's precisely why. You point your dish that one spot, bolt it down, and you never have to move it. It's stable. It's predictable.
But for a phone conversation, that distance is a killer.
It's a fundamental physics problem. They were sending a radio signal up 36,000 kilometers and back down 36,000 kilometers. Even traveling at the speed of light, that trip takes time. You get a round-trip delay latency of about a quarter to half a second.
Which doesn't sound like much on paper.
No, but in practice, it destroys the cadence of human conversation. You say hello, pause, wait. The other person hears it, they say hi, pause, wait. You end up constantly talking over each other. It's the news anchor delay effect.
Right, where they're awkwardly trying not to interrupt the person in the remote feed.
Exactly. But beyond just the annoyance, there is the power issue. To shout a signal across 36,000 kilometers, your phone needs a massive battery and a significant antenna. You aren't putting that in your pocket.
So it's like trying to have a conversation by shouting across the Grand Canyon. You need a megaphone, and you need to yell.
That's a perfect analogy. Whereas a Iridium solution was to stop shouting and just get closer, they decided to ignore GEO entirely and go for low Earth orbit, or LEO.
And when we say low, we mean drastically lower.
Oh, it's a completely different regime. We are talking about 781 kilometers up. Compare that to 36,000. It is like the difference between looking at a city from a plane versus standing on the roof of a skyscraper.
So the signal delay becomes negligible.
It's milliseconds. To the user, it feels instant. It feels like a landline or a cellular call. And because the satellite is right overhead, the path loss, the weakening of the signal over distance, is much, much lower. You can shrink the antenna, you can shrink the battery, you can hold the device in your hand.
But there is no free lunch in physics. I mean, there must be a catch. If you are that low, you can't park the satellite anymore. Gravity works differently down there.
That is the trade-off. That is the fundamental challenge they had to solve. To stay in orbit at 781 kilometers, you have to move incredibly fast to counteract gravity. Iridium satellites are traveling at roughly 27,000 kilometers per hour. They circle the entire planet every 100 minutes.
Every 100 minutes. So if I'm standing on the ground with my satellite phone, the satellite isn't hanging there. It's sprinting across the sky.
It is zooming. From the moment it rises above your horizon to the moment it sets on the other side, you have a window of about 7 to 9 minutes. That is it.
Which creates a massive engineering headache. If I'm on a 20-minute business call, the satellite I started talking to has set below the horizon long before I'm done.
Precisely. This is the core problem of LEO. If you use GEO, 3 satellites can cover the entire Earth, excluding the poles. With Iridium, because they are so low and their footprint on the ground is so small, you need a swarm. You need a massive constellation to ensure that as soon as one satellite leaves your view, another one is rising to take the handoff.
The call needs to be seamlessly handed from one satellite to the next, like a cell tower handoff on the highway, but in space.
But much faster and much more complex.
And this brings us to the name Iridium. I love this detail because it shows how the engineering informed the branding.
It does. It's a great little piece of tech history.
Yeah.
The original orbital calculations done by Motorola engineers suggested they needed exactly 77 satellites to cover the globe seamlessly.
In 77 is the atomic number of the element iridium on the periodic table.
Correct. It was this perfect metaphor, electrons orbiting the nucleus of the Earth. Iridium sounded futuristic, premium, strong. It sounded like something you could sell.
It sounds expensive.
It sounds expensive, exactly. But then the engineers, being engineers, kept crunching the numbers. They kept optimizing. And they realized they could optimize the orbital planes. They didn't need 77. They could do it with 66 active satellites.
Which creates a branding problem. The element with atomic number 66 is dysprosium.
Dysprosia.
Dysprosium Communications. Doesn't quite roll off the tongue.
It sounds like a stomach illness.
Or a sedative. Ask your doctor about dysprosium.
Right. And the word dysprosium comes from the Greek for hard to get at, which, considering the bankruptcy that was coming, might have been more accurate. But marketing won out. They stuck with the name Iridium. It was just better.
So we have 66 active satellites, but they aren't just randomly buzzing around like bees in a jar. This is a choreographed dance. How is the sky organized?
It is extremely precise. Imagine slicing the Earth like an orange into 6 wedges. These are the 6 orbital planes. Each plane passes over the north and south poles. In each of those 6 planes, you have 11 active satellites spaced out evenly, following each other in a line.
So they form a kind of cage around the planet.
A rotating bird cage, yes. As the Earth spins underneath, these planes sweep across the surface. This ensures that no matter where you are standing, Manhattan, Antarctica, or the middle of the Pacific, there is always at least one satellite in the sky above you.
Now, having satellites overhead is one thing, but connecting a call is another. And this brings us to what I think is the secret sauce of Iridium, the thing that makes it unique compared to Starlink, Globalstar, or almost anyone else.
Inter-satellite links, or ISLs. This is the technical marvel that defines the system. Most satellite systems are what we call bent pipes.
Okay, explain the bent pipe. What does that mean?
In a bent pipe system, you stand on the ground and send a signal up to the satellite. The satellite acts like a mirror in the sky. It just reflects that signal back down to a gateway or ground station, a big antenna farm connected to the fiber optic internet.
But for that to work, the satellite has to be able to see you and the ground station at the same time.
Correct. And that is the fundamental limitation. If you are in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from land, the satellite above you cannot see a ground station in California or Japan. It has nowhere to bounce your signal. So standard satellites often have gaps in coverage over oceans and poles.
But Iridium is different. Iridium satellites talk to each other.
They are a mesh network in space. It's incredible. Each Iridium satellite has 4 specialized antennas called crosslinks. It maintains a constant radio link with the satellite immediately in front of it in the same plane, the satellite immediately behind it, and the 2 satellites in the adjacent lanes to the left and right.
So it's constantly talking to its 4 closest neighbors.
Constantly. So if you are in the middle of the Sahara Desert and you make a call, your signal goes up to the satellite above you. That satellite software realizes, hey, I don't see a ground station, so it tosses your call to the satellite ahead of it.
Or sideways to another orbital plane.
Exactly. It routes the data packet through the constellation, hopping from satellite to satellite, bouncing across the globe in the vacuum of space. It might hop 5 or 6 times until it finds a satellite that is currently flying over a gateway, say, in Arizona or Norway. Only then does the signal come down to Earth to connect to the public telephone network.
That is incredible.
Yeah.
It means the network is autonomous. It doesn't care about geography. You don't need ground stations in every country. You just need the sky.
It allows Iridium to be the only provider that truly covers 100% of the planet's surface. Even Starlink, until they get their laser links fully operational and ubiquitous, relies heavily on ground stations. Iridium has had this mesh capability since 1998.
I read about a specific quirk in this mesh network, though, the seam. This sounds like a glitch in the Matrix. Can you explain that?
The seam. Yes. It's a fascinating consequence of the polar orbit geometry. Remember, all the satellites are traveling roughly north-south or south-north.
Right. They are flying pole to pole.
Well, imagine looking at the globe. On one side of the Earth, let's say over the Americas, the planes are moving north. But on the other side of the Earth, over Asia, they must be coming back down south.
Okay, that makes sense. Like lanes on a highway wrapping around a ball.
A perfect way to put it. So there must be a line where the north-moving planes meet the south-moving planes. 2 lanes of traffic moving in opposite directions.
And they're moving at 27,000 kilometers an hour. So the relative speed between them is double that.
Enormous. We are talking about closing speeds of nearly 54,000 kilometers per hour. The Doppler shift, the change in radio frequency caused by that speed, is simply too high for the inner satellite links to maintain a lock.
So they can't talk to each other across that line. The connection breaks.
Correct. At that seam where the counter-rotating planes meet, the satellites cannot talk to their neighbors sideways. They can only talk forward and backward within their own lane. The network software has to know where the seam is constantly and route calls around the zipper rather than across it.
It is mind-blowing to think about the software logic required to route a phone call through a shifting, spinning grid of 66 flying towers with a blind spot that moves across the planet.
It was a technological moonshot, a true marvel of engineering. And that's really where the Motorola story begins. This wasn't a startup in a garage. This was Motorola at the absolute height of its power.
Right. This is the late 80s, early 90s. Motorola is mobile communications. They invented the cell phone. They are titans.
They were the undisputed kings. And the story goes that this whole idea started because a Motorola executive's wife, Karen Berdiger, was complaining that her cell phone didn't work during a vacation in the Bahamas.
The classic necessity is the mother of invention, but the necessity was a wealthy tourist wanting to make a call from the beach.
That is the legend. Her husband, Barry Berdiger, along with Raymond Leopold and Ken Peterson, took that complaint and turned it into a whiteboard sketch. But because it was Motorola, they approached it with a manufacturing mindset that the space industry had never seen before.
What do you mean by that, a manufacturing mindset?
Well, you have to realize, before Iridium, satellites were handcrafted artisanal objects. They were like Ferraris or bespoke suits. You built one every year or two in a clean room with a team of 50 PhDs.
Right, they were one-offs.
One-offs. Incredibly expensive, incredibly slow to build, and Motorola needed 66-plus spares. They couldn't build them like Ferraris. They needed to build them like toasters. They needed an assembly line.
And I found this detail fascinating. They hired an engineer from Apple. Why?
They hired a guy who had worked on the Macintosh automated factory. They needed someone who knew mass production. They set up a literal production line. They standardized the chassis. At the peak of production, they were spitting out a fully functional communication satellite every 4.3 days.
Every 4 days. That is unprecedented speed, even by today's standards.
It was the Ford Model T moment for satellites. And the launch campaign was just as aggressive. They couldn't rely on just one rocket provider. They booked everything that could fly.
They were launching on American Delta II rockets. They were launching on Russian Proton rockets. They were launching on Chinese Long March rockets.
It was a logistical delay. Imagine the coordination. You are shipping sensitive U.S. technology to Kazakhstan and Taiwan, managing export controls, managing launch windows. They launched 72 satellites in just over 12 months. It remains one of the greatest feats of logistics in aerospace history.
And it worked. Technically, it worked. They got the birds up there. On November 1st, 1998, the service launches. The Vice President of the United States, Al Gore, makes the first ceremonial call.
He calls Gilbert Grosvenor the great-grandson of Alexander Graham Bell.
The symbolism is heavy. The torch is passed from the inventor of the telephone to the future of the telephone.
And then crickets. Just silence.
Nobody bought it.
The silence was deafening. The phones just sat on the shelves.
What went wrong? They had the tech, they had the coverage. Why did the business crash so hard?
It was a perfect storm of bad timing, bad economics, and arguably arrogance. First, the cost. The handset, the famous brick, cost $3,000.
$3,000 in 1998 money. That's like $6,000 or $7,000 today.
At least. And the calls. Up to $7 a minute.
Ouch. So a 10-minute check-in is $70. Who is this for?
That was the problem. They thought it was for globetrotting executives. But the bigger problem wasn't just the price, it was the competition. While Motorola was spending 11 years and $5 billion building the space network, terrestrial cellular networks, GSM towers on the ground were exploding. They were getting cheaper, the coverage was expanding into the suburbs, and the phones were getting tiny.
The Nokia era, the little candy bar phone.
Exactly. People wanted small phones that fit in a pocket. The Iridium phone was a literal brick with a thick antenna you had to rotate. And there was a critical physical limitation, line of sight.
Right. Iridium signals are weak by the time they hit the ground. They can't penetrate concrete.
You have to be outside. You have to see the sky. If you are a CEO in a skyscraper in Manhattan, your $3,000 Iridium phone is a paperweight. If you are in a car without an external antenna magnet mounted to the roof, it doesn't work.
So the addressable market wasn't everyone. It was just oil rig workers, deep-sea fishermen, and spies.
And there weren't enough of them to pay back the loans. Motorola had projected millions of subscribers. By the time they filed for bankruptcy, they had something like 10,000. It was a rounding error.
And the customer service was apparently a disaster.
Oh, a total mess. There is a famous account by CNN writer David Rode. He tried to sign up to test the system. He got the runaround, a broken website, no sales reps called him back. It was a classic engineering company problem. They built a miracle product, but forgot to build a sales department.
So 9 months, that's how long it lasted. 9 months after Al Gore made that call, Iridium filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
It was one of the largest bankruptcies in U.S. history at the time. We're talking about erasing $4 billion in debt. Investors were wiped out. Motorola took a massive, massive hit.
And it got dark. I mean, literally and metaphorically. Motorola basically said, look, this is costing us millions just to keep the lights on. If we can't sell it, we are going to destroy it.
They announced a deorbit plan. They were going to command the satellites one by one to lower their altitude and burn up in the atmosphere.
Imagine that. $5 billion of cutting-edge technology, fully functional, working perfectly, about to be turned into fireworks because the business model didn't work.
It would have been the most expensive display of pyrotechnics in human history. A $5 billion bonfire.
But they didn't burn up. Enter the unlikely savior.
The Pentagon.
The ultimate user.
Yeah.
The one customer you can't ignore.
The U.S. Department of Defense looked at this system and realized something. They had special forces in Afghanistan, ships in the Pacific, operatives in places where building a cell tower wasn't an option, and critically, they realized the value of the mesh.
Because the mesh doesn't touch the ground.
Exactly. If you are a U.S. operative in a hostile country, you don't want your phone call routing through a local phone switch that the hostile government controls. With Iridium, the signal goes up and stays in space until it hits a secure gateway in Hawaii or Virginia. It bypasses local infrastructure. That is incredibly valuable strategically.
So they stepped in, they saw a strategic asset about to be destroyed.
They didn't buy the company outright, but they offered a lifeline. A 2-year, $72 million contract for unlimited airtime for 20,000 government users. It was just enough cash flow to keep the lights on. It kept the system alive.
And this allowed a new group of private investors to swoop in. And this
Yeah.
has to be the business deal of the century.
It truly is. Dan Collissy, a former airline executive, put together a group. They bought the entire Iridium constellation, the 66 satellites, the spares, the ground stations, the control centers, the patents, everything.
What did they pay for it?
$25 million.
$25 million. For a system that cost $5 billion.
That is 0.5% of the construction cost. It's like buying a brand new aircraft carrier for the price of a yacht.
And that completely changed the math.
It fixed the business model instantly. The reason Iridium failed was the debt service. They had to pay hundreds of millions in interest payments. The new company had zero debt. They didn't need millions of subscribers. They just needed enough users to pay for electricity and salaries. Suddenly, Iridium was a profitable business.
So they are back from the dead. They are servicing the military. They are finding niche markets in maritime and aviation. But space is a dangerous place. And in 2009, Iridium makes history again, in a way they really didn't want to.
February 10th, 2009. This is a date that every orbital mechanics engineer knows by heart.
Set the scene for us. What happened?
You have Iridium 33. It's one of the original first-generation satellites cruising over Siberia at 789 kilometers altitude. It's doing its job, routing calls. And crossing its path is Cosmos 2251.
What was Cosmos 2251?
It was a defunct Russian military communications satellite. It had been dead for years, just a 900-kilogram hunk of metal drifting in orbit. No propulsion, no control, just garbage, space junk.
And they occupy the same altitude bands.
A LEO is crowded, but space is big. Usually things miss each other by kilometers. We have close approaches all the time. But this time, the probabilities collapsed. At 16.56 UTC, they collided.
And when things collide in low Earth orbit, it's not like a car crash. It's not a fender bender.
No. The relative speed was about 11,700 meters per second. That is roughly 22,000 miles per hour.
I can't even visualize that speed.
At that velocity, solid aluminum behaves like a liquid upon impact. The energy release is explosive. It's pure kinetic energy. Both satellites were instantly pulverized.
And this created the debris clouds.
It created a shotgun blast of shrapnel, 2,000 pieces of large debris stuff big enough to track with radar, and tens of thousands of smaller pieces. These clouds of debris started spreading out into rings around the Earth, threatening other satellites, including the International Space Station. It was the first time two intact satellites had collided in hypervelocity.
It was a wake-up call for the entire space industry.
It was the realization of the Kessler syndrome, the fear that one collision creates debris, which causes more collisions until LEO becomes a wasteland. It was a terrifying moment.
How did Iridium respond? They just lost a node in their mesh. Did the calls drop?
Briefly, in that region, yes. But this is where the Constellation design shined. Remember those spares we mentioned? Motorola had launched extra satellites that were just parking in orbit, dormant.
Waiting for a rainy day.
Exactly. Iridium engineers on the ground commanded a spare, Iridium 91, to fire its thrusters. They maneuvered it into the exact slot where Iridium 33 used to be. It took a few weeks to drift into place, but they patched the hole. The network healed itself.
That is resilience. But the clock was ticking. These satellites were designed for an 8-year life. By 2010, they were pushing 12, 13 years old. They were running on borrowed time.
Exactly. The batteries were degrading, the electronics were aging in the harsh radiation environment. They needed a whole new fleet. But launching 66 satellites is expensive. They didn't have Motorola's deep pockets anymore.
Enter the next player in our story, SpaceX.
This is a pivotal moment for both companies. In 2010, SpaceX was not the juggernaut it is today. They had only flown the Falcon 9 once or twice. They were risky. But Iridium needed a cheap ride to space, and SpaceX needed a marquee customer to prove their reliability.
So Iridium took a bet on the new kid on the block.
Matt Desch, the CEO of Iridium, took a massive bet. They signed the largest commercial launch deal ever at the time, $492 million to launch the new Constellation, Iridium and XT.
And this was a massive campaign. Between 2017 and 2019, they launched 75 satellites. 8 launches. And they had to do something incredibly difficult, swap out the old satellites for the new ones without dropping a call.
It has been compared to changing the engine of a car while driving down the highway at 70 miles per hour.
How do you even do that? How do you replace a satellite in a working mesh?
It's a delicate slot swap. You fly the new satellite right up next to the old one, sometimes just a few kilometers apart. You sync them up. Then the ground control sends a command to transfer the identity of the node. The new satellite takes over the crosslinks to the neighbors. The old satellite is commanded to let go.
And then, what happens to the old one?
Then you fire the thrusters on the old satellite to lower it into the atmosphere to burn up. A controlled deorbit. They did this 66 times, flawlessly.
And these new satellites, Iridium and XT, they weren't just replacements, they were upgrades.
Huge upgrades. They still do voice, obviously, but they added new capabilities that transformed the business model. The biggest one is a payload called Arion.
Unpack Arion for us. This is related to planes disappearing, right?
Precisely. Think about MH370, the Malaysian Airlines flight that vanished. The public was shocked to learn that we could lose a Boeing 777.
We all assume that air traffic control watches planes like a video game, like dots on a screen.
They do, but only over land. Ground radar relies on line of sight. It only reaches about 200 miles offshore. Once a plane is over the mid-Atlantic or the Pacific, it disappears from the radar screen. The pilots have to radio in their position every 15 or 30 minutes.
Which seems archaic in the 21st century.
It is. So Iridium had an idea. Every modern commercial plane broadcasts a signal called ADS-B. It's an automatic squawk that says, here is who I am, here is my altitude, here's my speed.
And usually ground stations pick that up.
Right. Iridium said, why don't we put a receiver on our satellites and listen from space?
So now, because Iridium covers 100% of the globe, there is literally nowhere on Earth a plane can hide.
Correct. The system provides real-time global flight tracking. It updates every few seconds, everywhere. It allows air traffic controllers to see planes over the poles and oceans. This means planes can fly closer together safely, saving fuel and time. It is a revolution in aviation safety, and it rides on the back of the Iridium mesh.
And they also added Stardust, which sounds like a spell from Harry Potter, but I gather it is broadband.
It is L-band broadband. Now, we have to manage expectations here. This isn't Starlink or fiber optic speed. We are talking speeds up to 704 kilobits per second.
So early DSL speeds. You aren't streaming 4K Netflix.
No, absolutely not. But if you are on a ship in a massive storm, you don't care about Netflix. You care about reliability. L-band is a low frequency with a long wavelength. It is incredibly robust. It punches through rain, snow, and hurricane clouds much better than the high-frequency Ka or Ku bands that Starlink or typical VSAT systems use.
It's the rugged, all-terrain vehicle of the internet.
That's a great analogy. It's not fast, but it will get the message through.
And there's one more secret feature. STL, satellite time and location.
This is becoming huge. We live in a world that is utterly dependent on GPS, not just for maps, but for time. Financial markets, power grids, cell towers, they all sync their clocks to GPS.
But GPS is vulnerable.
The GPS signal is incredibly weak by the time it hits Earth. It is like seeing a 20-watt light bulb from 12,000 miles away. It is easy to jam or spoof. Iridium signal is about 1,000 times stronger than GPS because the satellites are closer. They developed a way to use the Iridium signal to verify location and time. It is becoming a critical backup for national infrastructure.
It is amazing how this thing that was supposed to be a phone for yuppies has become the backbone of critical infrastructure. Which brings us to who is actually using this today. It's not just the military anymore.
No, the consumer market has actually come back around, but not in the way Motorola thought. It's not about replacing your iPhone, it's about the companion device.
Right, the gadgets you see at outdoor stores, the Garmin InReach.
Exactly. I suspect many listeners might have one of these. These are small orange bricks, much smaller than the original phone, that connect to your smartphone via Bluetooth. You use an app to send texts via satellite.
I have a friend who hikes the Pacific Crest Trail.
Yeah.
And she swears by the Zoleo. It's that peace of mind, the SOS button.
That SOS button is a direct line to the Iridium constellation. If you break your leg in a canyon in Utah, you press that button. The signal bounces off a satellite 780 kilometers up, goes through the mesh, comes down to a rescue coordination center, and they dispatch a helicopter. It saves lives essentially every day.
And it's not just hikers, it's changing the maritime world, too. For a long time, there was a monopoly there, right?
Yes, in Marthot, they held the monopoly on the GMDSS Global Maritime Distress and Safety System. This is the international law of the sea. If you're a big ship, you must have a certified distress system.
So if the ship is sinking, you push the button and the Coast Guard knows.
In 2020, the regulations finally changed to allow Iridium into the club. This was a big deal because Inmarsat is GEO-based. It doesn't cover the polar regions well.
And the polar regions are getting busier with climate change.
Exactly. As the ice melts, the Northwest Passage is opening up. Research vessels, cargo ships, even cruise ships are going further north and south. Iridium is often the only GMDSS option that works in those high latitudes.
And then there's the Internet of Things. I didn't realize how much stuff talks to Iridium.
It is massive. They call it SBD short burst data. It's tiny packets of information. Think of it like a tweet from a machine.
Give me an example.
Tsunami warning buoys. They float in the middle of the Indian Ocean. They don't need to stream video. They just need to wake up once an hour and say, wave height normal. Or, critically, wave height spiking.
Or tracking a shipping container.
Yeah.
Or a polar bear with a collar.
Exactly. Pipeline monitoring in the Alaskan tundra, heavy equipment tracking in the Amazon. There are millions of these little modems out there just chirping small bits of data up to the sky. It's a silent, invisible pulse of the global economy.
It sounds like a pure success story, but we are living in a complicated world, and global coverage means global coverage. Which brings us to the geopolitics. Iridium works in Russia.
This is a sensitive topic, and it's important to be clear. Historically, Iridium had a Russian subsidiary. They had to. To operate in Russian airspace, you need a license. They even had a gateway in Izhevsk. The Russian military and National Guard used Iridium because, again, it works in Siberia where nothing else does.
Then comes 2022, the invasion of Ukraine.
Right. Iridium, being a U.S. company, had to comply with strict sanctions. They stopped shipping equipment to Russia. They cut off the direct relationship.
But the phones still work.
The satellites are still flying over Russia. You can't turn off the physics of the orbit, and you can't easily turn off the service for a specific region without potentially hurting innocent users or emergency services. Plus, there have been reports, investigative journalism in 2023, suggesting that Iridium devices are still finding their way to the front lines on the Russian side.
The gray market.
Exactly. A third-party buyer in a neutral country buys the handsets and ships them into Russia. It highlights the double-edged sword of this technology. It is neutral. The satellite doesn't know if the person holding the phone is a Ukrainian defender, a Russian aggressor, or a lost hiker. It just processes the signal.
It connects to that end of privacy theme we touched on. You cannot hide from the mesh. Speaking of not hiding, let's talk about the future. Because recently there was a lot of hype about direct-to-device. The idea that my regular iPhone or Android could talk to a satellite without a separate box.
This is the holy grail, the Star Trek communicator. No extra dongles, just your phone.
And Iridium tried to do this with Qualcomm, the chip giant. They announced Snapdragon satellite. It was going to be huge, and then it wasn't.
The deal fell apart in late 2023, and the reason is fascinating. It wasn't that the tech didn't work. The tech worked fine. It was a business disagreement about standards.
What do you mean by standards?
Iridium uses a proprietary waveform. It's their own language. To talk to Iridium, you need a chip that speaks Iridium. The phone manufacturers, the Samsungs and Xiaomis of the world, didn't want to be locked into a proprietary solution. They want to use the 5G standard.
5G NTN. What is that?
Non-terrestrial networks. The global body that sets standards for cell phones, 3GPP, created a standard for how phones should talk to satellites. The phone makers want a standard chip that can talk to any compatible satellite, not just Iridium's.
So Qualcomm pulled the plug on the Iridium-specific deal. Did that kill Iridium's consumer dreams?
No, it forced a pivot, and this is Project Stardust.
Project Stardust. It sounds magical.
It is their plan to adopt the standard. Instead of forcing phones to speak Iridium, Iridium is updating its system to speak phone. They are developing a service based on NB-IoT narrowband Internet of Things that fits the 5G standard.
So the idea is, in a few years, I could have a regular phone, and if I walk out of cell range, it seamlessly switches to the Iridium satellite overhead to send a text without me buying a special Garmin device.
That is the vision for 2026. And because Iridium has the licensed spectrum, which is gold in this industry, and the existing Constellation already flying, they have a huge head start over companies that are just launching satellites now. They don't need to launch new satellites. They just need to update the software and the ground systems.
That is a game changer. We are rapidly approaching a world where no service just isn't a thing anymore.
We really are. We are closing the last few gaps on the map.
So as we wrap this up, let's zoom out. We started with a flare in the sky in a bankrupt company. We ended up with a mesh network that tracks every plane, saves hikers, and might soon be inside every pocket. What is the big takeaway for you here?
For me, it is about the density of the infrastructure we have built above our heads. We often think of space as out there, separate from us, but Iridium proved that space is actually part of our terrestrial economic layer. It is a utility like the power grid or the water main. It is invisible, it is always on, and we only notice it when it breaks or when we really, really need it.
It's the ultimate safety net.
It is. But I want to leave you with a thought about that no-service concept.
Go on.
We used to go to the mountains or the ocean to escape, to be unreachable. With Project Stardust and the integration of satellite tech into standard phones, we are effectively turning the entire surface of the Earth into a single cell tower.
There is no off the grid.
Unless you turn the device off. But the potential for connection is everywhere. What does it do to the human psyche when solitude becomes technically impossible? When you are always just a ping away from the office, the news, the noise?
That is a haunting thought.
Mm,
We built the perfect communication machine, and now we have to live inside it.
indeed.
Well, on that note, I want to encourage you to do something tonight. Go outside, look up. You won't see an iridium flare anymore. The new satellites have different antennas that don't reflect the sun the same way. The flares are gone.
But the satellites are still there.
They are. Every few minutes, one is silently zooming over your head, closing a link, listening for a signal, keeping the mesh alive. It's quite a show, even if you can't see it.
It certainly is.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you on the next one.